in Bangladesh. So Bangladesh protests have erupted in response to the implementation of a quota system for government jobs, which have continued through a long period of time. And now the current government has brutally cracked down on the protesters, shutting down the internet and restricting phone capabilities. The protests, as I mentioned, are over a quota system that awards children of quote unquote freedom fighters, i.e., people who have fought in Bangladesh's War of Independence. It awards them 1/3 of all public sector jobs, and many of the student protesters believe that these jobs should be based purely on merit. Now, these protests started as just students, but now it has expanded to a wider community, as well as the list of concerns and demands that the protesters have or that they're protesting about. Some of them include the fact that although Bangladesh's economy has done much better in the last 10, even 20 years, with poverty and per capita income decreasing and increasing respectively dramatically, university graduates still face very high levels of unemployment. In fact, in some cases, even higher levels of unemployment than those with a lesser level of education. Also, corruption is a huge issue, with many people believing that the economic growth in Bangladesh is really only significantly helping those close to the ruling party. Now, for what it's worth, according to transparency.org, an organization that measures corruption around the world, Bangladesh, as you can see here, has become increasingly corrupt since 2017, and they now rank 149th out of 180, with 180 being the most corrupt country. Additionally, many people are increasingly worried that the current Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina, is becoming or has already become an autocrat, with the government having stifled dissent and media. Now, back to the protest specifically. Now, the more than 100 people have died as a result of these protests, but the government and the Prime Minister Hasina has continually denied the use of excessive force by the police, claiming that the protests were infiltrated by the opposition parties and the Islamist parties, which are responsible for the violence. Now, a list of 9 demands has been released by the protesters in an underground press release. I'm not going to read all of them, but 2 notable ones are that the Prime Minister Hasina accept responsibility for the killing of the protesters and apologize in public for doing so. And the second one is that the Bangladesh Chhatra League, or the BCL, be banned from student politics. Now, BCL is essentially a pro-government, quote, vigilante group that can kill, kidnap, or disappear at party command. I'm quoting Shahidul Alam, an acclaimed Bengali writer and photographer, in an Al Jazeera piece here. Now, in that same piece, according to Alam, both of those demands, particularly the Prime Minister Hasina apologizing, are incredibly unlikely to happen. Particularly, again, the apology, because according to Alam, Hasina is hell-bent on conveying to Bangladesh and the world that she is an invincible dictator. Now we are going to go to another set of protests, but this time happening in Africa. So in Kenya, anti-government protests against Kenyan President William Ruto have continued into their sixth week, which started because of anger over a bill that would cause a tax hike has resulted in at least 50 people being killed. The bill imposed tax increases on things like sanitary towels, bread, oil, and other goods, and it comes at a time when Kenyans already deal with an extremely high cost of living. The protests are also fueled by many people's beliefs that the Kenyan government prioritizes US and international relations more than the welfare of its own people. Of course, as usual with protests, as they evolve, the protests become more than about just one thing. So now, among the problems that people are protesting, um, or among the demands that they're protesting about, they're asking the president to deal with bad governance, corruption, and the mismanagement of funds. Now, the police, in response to these protests, have been brutal, and they've used violence. They've used violent force, including tear gas, water cannons, and even live bullets, causing many to fear that further escalation could cause a descent into anarchy. However, others still believe that there is a hope with these protests to end bad governance and root out corruption in the government. Now, the peak of these protests occurred on June 25th, when the protesters stormed and supposedly burned part of the parliament after the bill that raised taxes was passed. Since then, these protests have occurred on a weekly basis. Now, although the President Ruto has, since the protests started, succumbed to some of the demands, including firing many cabinet secretaries, he actually quickly responded by reappointing many of those cabinet secretaries that he just fired, which sparked greater anger among the protesters in Kenya. Now, besides the storming of the parliament, the actual protesters, these young protesters, have been relatively peaceful. And they're organized almost entirely via social media, with no clear leader in charge. However, the flip side of this is that because they're organized on social media and there's no clear leader who's in charge, it makes it very easy or easier for these protests to be infiltrated by criminal gangs, which these criminal gangs that have infiltrated these protests are the ones that have actually brought violence and looting to the situation. Additionally, some people allege that the violence in these protests is actually orchestrated by government agents that are hijacking the protests to make these protests look more violent or worse than they actually are. And finally, these protests have also inspired other protests in nearby African countries, most notably in neighboring Uganda and Nigeria. Staying in Africa, we're going to turn to kidnappings in Central Africa. So kidnappings are at an extremely high level in the so-called, quote, triangle of death of Africa, which encompasses Chad, Cameroon, and the Central African Republic. Chad authorities have said that ransoms paid to kidnappers amounted to 43 million Central African francs in 2022 and 52 million Central African francs in 2023. For reference, that is about 70,000 USD and 86,000 USD, respectively. Now, we've talked about kidnappings in Nigeria in the past, but reports are that many terrorist groups, including Boko Haram, have actually moved from northern Nigeria to this triangle of death. So we can see there's a connection between those two stories. Now, the victims of these kidnappings are most commonly traders, civil servants, aid workers, and really anybody that the kidnapping of whom would produce a large sum or would be capable of producing a large sum for their ransom. Um, Now, another piece of this is that it's important to note that the large presence of private military companies like Wagner in the Central African Republic have deterred some of the mercenaries in the Central African Republic, but the kidnappings are still rampant in Chad. Um, I'm no means, I'm by no means endorsing private military companies, but I do think it's worth stating that they have, at least it appears, initially reduced um, the frequency of the kidnappings. Of course, these private military companies come with a lot of other negative things, such as stealing resources, manipulating governments, and it also makes it so the current government, um, I guess, doesn't develop adequate techniques to deal with these kidnappings or deal with the prevalence of these kidnappings. But anyway, it's just worth noting that these private military companies, the presence of them have reduced some of the numbers. Um, Finally, of course, the economic impact of these kidnappings have been made much more difficult because both transport of goods is more difficult and because farmers are afraid to work, uh, which causes food shortages and bad harvests. Okay, moving now to Latin America um, and the Caribbean. Uh, in Haiti, tragically, 40 people were killed last Friday at sea after a boat fleeing Haiti en route to the island of Turks and Caicos caught fire. Um, Fortunately, 41 people on board were also saved by the Haitian Coast Guard. Of course, it's still very sad that 40 people were killed, but um, very heroically, 41 people were saved. Um, Now, somewhat ironically, but again, very tragically, the reason the boat caught fire was supposedly some passengers had lit some passengers had lit matches as part of a ritual for safe travel. And because of this, the gasoline filled drums of the boat caught fire and exploded. Um, Now, of course, partly responsible for this tragedy is the impact of gang violence and the gang takeover in Haiti, which has forced a huge number of Haitians to flee any way they can. Um, Another point worth noting is that a harsh policy towards Haitian migrants by the Dominican Republic has likely made it more difficult for Haitian migrants to escape, uh, as the DR would probably be otherwise the easiest escape route for Haitians, considering they share the same island as Haiti. Um, but of course, it's very difficult to go there because the DR has imposed a strict policy against Haitian migrants. So that's all for the news stories. As I've said, if you have anything to add, if you want to send me uh, news stories in your own countries, in your own area, or those that you're interested to, please do by all the methods I just mentioned. And then also, if you think I missed something or want to add something and want to correct something, please either say that in the comments or send me a message or If you want to send me additional sources that you think have more information or are better than the ones that I have, please do so. I would very much appreciate it, particularly if they're local sources and they're reliable. Please send me them.